We have 9 people in the meeting room. In the waiting room. I mean, we have Tita Norms from the Palestine Friendship Association. Palestine Philippines Friendship Association. She's here.
Danya, can you post the YouTube link?
Yeah.
To our
generating it now.
Our messenger.
Dadrag internet.
Okay, are we ready?
I'll start. Nerdine is here.
Okay, shall we begin?
Okay na?
Okay na. Okay, so good morning, good evening.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. On behalf of...
Wait lang, Kabong, I haven't admitted people into the meeting room.
Teka, Kabong, ipapakilala muna kita. Kabong.
Alam ko, ikaw na yung... Wait lang. O, sige.
Ipapakilala kita. Tapos magpapapasok muna siya.
Okay, so people are in the meeting room now. I'm trying to get the link for the YouTube live. It's taking a bit.
Nerdin.
So we're all here. Nerdine is here. She's listening in.
Nerdin.
So we're just waiting for Dan to give us the link.
Yeah, people are in the meeting room now. We have people on chat.
Are we ready to launch?
Donna Miranda from Saka is here.
Si Khaled.
Are we ready? Danya, is it okay to begin?
Yeah, we can start. But the YouTube, we're live on YouTube supposedly, but I disseminate the link. But yeah, we should be good to go.
Okay. Thank you so much. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. To our participants who are here with us on Zoom, as well as our audience on YouTube. Welcome to our webinar. This month is the International League of People's Struggles October month of solidarity for Palestine. And this webinar, Solidarity with Palestinian Freedom, or Stand with Palestinian Freedom, is sponsored by the Center for International Studies, the International League of People's Struggle Philippines chapter, and Bayan, or Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, our National Alliance. To give us welcome remarks on behalf of the sponsors, we have here the chairperson of the ILPS Philippines chapter. He's also the chairperson of the militant trade union movement in the Philippines, Kilusang Mayo Uno, or May 1st movement. Let us all welcome Elmer Labog.
Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. On behalf of the organizers of today's webinar, the International League of People's Struggle Philippines chapter, the University of the Philippines Center for International Studies, the Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, or the New Patriotic Alliance, I wish to express my militant and wholehearted welcome to our wonderful guest speakers, participants to this webinar, both here and on Zoom and YouTube. Thank you for being with us today. I wish to recognize our esteemed speakers for today's webinar, Comrade Khaled Barakat, Comrade Nerdin Kizwani, and Comrade Professor Corina Mulin. To facilitate this event, we are also joined by our comrades from the Bayan, ILPS, and the University of the Philippines. Comrades Sara Raimundo and Dania Reyes. I want to thank the activists, professors, students, friends, and allies from the Philippines and all over the world who are here with us today. Solidarity and strength to you all as we face all the challenges of this pandemic and the rise of authoritarianism worldwide. I cannot overstate how important this event is for the Philippine movement for national liberation. Our call to stand for Palestinian freedom is an expression of our deep appreciation and respect for the Palestinian struggle for national liberation and against Zionist occupation. Apart from that, it also marks a remarkable development in the struggle for national liberation in the Philippines. We are holding this webinar with joyful hope and pride because it signifies our movement's painstaking efforts at meeting our Palestinian comrades halfway to build a broad, united anti-Zionist, anti-fascist, and anti-imperialist front along with other progressive and organized forces worldwide. Thus, our call for October as the Global Month of Solidarity with Palestine, following the Global Month of Solidarity for the Philippines last month, is also a celebration and amplification of the unities we have forged through the years. In the latest International League of People's Struggles Congress held in Hong Kong in June 2019, Commission 11, in which educators, research staff, and education personnel from different continents converged to fight imperialism and build a bright socialist future, submitted a brave and decisive resolution to the League. And I quote, a resolution to support the boycott, the divestment, sanctions, or the BDS movement to the international support to end international support for Israel's oppression of Palestinians. Whereas ILPS Commission 11 has expressed support for the Palestinian national liberation struggle since the 5th ILPS assembly held in the Philippines in 2015, whereas the apartheid state of Israel has wrought untold sufferings and countless deaths upon the people of Palestine, whereas the people of Palestine assert their right to self-determination amidst violent occupation and the most inhuman sanctions, whereas the ILPS Commission 11 has participated in the first 2018 Palestinian Lives Conference, whereas the Students for Justice in Palestine SJP has reached out to our unions and member organizations for solidarity with the BDS campaign. Now, therefore, be it resolved that we, the ILPS Commission 11, express strong support to the boycott, divestment, sanctions, to end international support for Israel's oppression of Palestinians. In November 2015, freedom fighter comrade Laila Khaled was the keynote speaker at the ILPS 5th General Assembly held here in the Philippines. By the way, she would have liked, Laila Khaled would have liked to join us today, but she has some checkup ongoing in a hospital for some health concern. I hope she immediately recuperates. Immediately following the ILPS Congress was an important event held at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, the launching of the Philippine-Palestine Friendship Association, also graced by Comrade Laila Khaled and other Palestinian comrades. We have been in constant communication with our Palestinian comrades, always finding ways to arouse, organize, and mobilize. To mark the 70th anniversary of the Nakba, or the catastrophe in May 2018, comrades from ILPS, Bayan, and within our lifetime formed a panel on international solidarity conference at Hunter College in New York to discuss how our struggles may not be exactly the same, but are deeply connected. And two of them are in this webinar, namely Nerden Kiswani, our guest speaker, and Professor Sarah Raimunda, our host and moderator. I understand that our comrades in Bayan USA and allied organizations like Anak Bayan are closely working with our Palestinian comrades in the diaspora who are asserting the right of return to Palestine within our lifetime. To our Palestinian comrades, we want you to know that we hold the right of return within our lifetime, close to our hearts. And we, your Filipino comrades, are ready to struggle and fight with you by any means necessary. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat. Long live international solidarity. From the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestinian will be free. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Bong, or Kabong Labog. Again, that was our KMU chairperson and ILPS chairperson, Philippines chapter, Elmer Labog. So we're about to start our program and introduce our speakers. But before we do that, I would just like to remind everyone the reason why we're here. We're having this webinar, and this it's exactly because we don't want to forget about Palestine despite everything. And we have invited our esteemed speakers because we believe that they have the greatest capacity to share with us what it means to stand with Palestinian freedom. And when we say stand for Palestinian freedom, we mean its various dimensions. We want to learn more about, how to support Palestinian freedom in terms of the popular movement, the Revolutionary Armed Resistance, the BDS campaign, and all the other political campaigns that our comrades have been really working so hard for all throughout this year. So let me begin with our first speaker. Our first speaker is a well-known Palestinian writer and activist. He was subjected to a political ban and excluded from Germany for his political activity and expression on Palestine. But he's here today, and he's been with ILPS in some of its webinars in the past. And we're happy to have you here, Comrade Khaled Barakat.
Thank you so much, Comrade Sarah. Thank you, comrades in ILPS, for organizing this webinar and also for all of the hard work you have been putting this month in particular in solidarity with Palestine. I have been following closely the educational seminars and the webinars and the material that you have put out for people in solidarity with Palestine this month. You have covered various different issues from occupation to colonization to settlements to boycott movement and right of return. So I really am honored to be here, and we're very grateful for this amazing work. This is the way to build the bridges between our two struggles. And as the two people, the people of the Philippines and the people of Palestine, are standing in the front lines of combating imperialism and reactionary and fascist regimes. I would like to talk to you today about the role of the Palestinian refugees in the Palestinian revolutionary movements. And it is really essential to look at the role of Palestinian refugees in that regard. As you know, Palestine um, witnessed what we called a Nakba, which means the catastrophe. And this term actually was first invented or written by a Syrian philosopher and scholar. His name is Konstantin Zreik. He described what happened in Palestine in 1947 and 1948 as the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. And indeed, it was catastrophe because it changed the entire life of a nation. Palestine have been colonized before 1948 many times, and the Palestinian people have fought colonizations for throughout their history. But the difference between the what happened in Palestine in the early 1900s and the previous experiences is that this one was a imperialist uh, agenda and a Zionist racist movement that was born in Europe decided to establish a base for imperialism and colonization using the Zionist movement in Europe as their tool to establish what they call the state of Israel at the expense of the Palestinian people. So here we are in front of a different kind of colonization. It is a settler colonization where the idea and the goal was to uproot the indigenous native population and replace them with settlers from Europe. And so in 1948, the vast majority of Palestinians found themselves to be refugees after they fought the British colonization and the Zionist terrorist gangs that was terrorizing the Palestinian population. And, you know, Palestinians have launched the Great Revolution of 1936 in order to protect their land and also to oppose the establishment of any Zionist state in Palestine. The vast majority of Palestinians after 1948 became refugees. Almost 66% of our people have found themselves to be living in refugee camps. Now, when we look at how Palestinians were living in Palestine, the majority of our people were farmers and peasants and workers, so they found themselves living in these tents and subjugated to all forms of oppression at the hands of the Arab reactionary regimes, whether in Lebanon or Jordan or elsewhere. And so you can imagine how a population is going to fight all of this very strong imperialist powers and they're refugees with basically nothing. They have lost their land and they have lost everything. And so for them to fight back in these uh, social and economic conditions as refugees was really a very impossible almost for Palestinians to do. But regardless, with their resilience and their commitment to the struggle, Palestinians began from the very first day to fight back for their right to return. And some of these struggles were uh, popular and educational struggle to teach children, for example, in refugee camps, to sing a song every morning that says, Palestine is our only homeland and we will return. But this wasn't easy. In order for them to actually do these things, as simple and as basic as it sounds, each one of those were a battle because the government would refuse, and because of the UNRWA, also the United Nations Relief Agency that was established 2 years after the Nakba. They were not just an agency that worked to provide jobs for Palestinian refugees. They also were an oppressors, almost a tool of oppression, and so they would refuse these kind of Palestinian struggle, even on a cultural and political level. Also, after the 1948 Nakba, there were Palestinian students who were studying in Lebanon in the universities, and these were radical Palestinian students, and they wanted to also get engaged in the struggle, finding themselves to be refugees. They can't go back home. So the very first attempts of organized Palestinian struggle outside of Palestine, carried by the Palestinian refugees, were to establish what they called كتائب الفداء العربي, and it means the Arab Freedom Fighters Brigades. And these and students, their analysis at that time were that if we lost our homeland because of Arab reactionary involvement and treasons of these kings who allied themselves with the Zionists, then the way forward is to carry military operation against these regimes and assassinate these kings and these oppressors. And it was very kind of a naive way of looking at things, even though it was noble and revolutionary in essence, but it was very limited. And so 2 years later, they reevaluated this process and said that the only way forward is when we organize our people. And so we have to leave the student campuses and the universities and go to the refugee camps where our people actually lives. And this was a very important step in the struggle of Palestinian refugees because they have transformed the students and youth along with the radical youth and strugglers in the camps have formed what later to be known as the Arab Ban movement, which became a very strong radical movement that did not have an actual um, detailed program or an ideology, but they did supported Arab unity, they supported socialism, they supported the oppressed classes, and so they actually became the one of the most strongest movement in the Arab world. But notice that the word Palestine was not the central of their work. It was the Arab word and not the Palestinian, because there were no Palestinian political entities or political parties then. So Palestinian refugees joined the communist parties in the region, or they joined Al-Ba'ath Party, or they joined the Pan-Arab movement. Only until mid-60s that Palestinians launched their own political organized party, especially after the establishment of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and then later on, Palestinian armed groups have joined the PLO and revolutionized the institution, and it became the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people for at that time. And so when we look at the major changes that happened in the political scene on the question of Palestine, it was done mostly by Palestinian refugees in outside in exile and also inside Palestine, but mostly outside Palestine because they had more of a free movement that they can mobilize. It was mostly based in the refugee camps, and so they had um, a more of access to the world and to the Arab world than their brothers and sisters under occupation and under military occupation. And for the people of the Philippines, maybe this is very, they can understand us when we say that, you know, people being colonized by a foreign uh, army that does not speak your language, and you find yourself under these military rules. Uh, People who are struggle against colonization, they understand us when we talk about this. But this actually shaped an experience, and this experience is that this is not a conflict between, you know, Palestinians and Jews. This is a conflict between Palestinians and against imperialism and colonization. And this project of Israel, the settler colonialist project, has a very tight connection to the power of imperialism. So Palestinian developed the their political education through struggle, and they understood that they are uh, confronting an imperialist and Zionist and reactionary camp, and they're not just fighting Israel; they are actually fighting other imperialist forces, and that's why it was really important for Palestinians to engage in other people's struggle and to carry out this struggle to other arenas. For example, Palestinians in the 60s have uh, established a very strong relationship with the Algerian Revolution, with Cuba, and Vietnam, the um, relationship with the people of Ireland, South Africa, the struggle of the Kurds, the Iranian movements that was fighting against the Shah. Palestinians played a leadership role in order to bring these struggles into the world eyes and to get an international recognition and attention. So, for example, they organized the very first international conference against racism in South Africa in 1976. Many people did not know what was happening in South Africa. The Palestinian people helped in bringing the struggle of the indigenous struggle to the United Nations, and they pushed for support for this struggle through the Arab and Muslim blocs and the non-alliance blocs and the African blocs. And so these were very important steps that Palestinians took in their struggle in order to connect their struggle with other nations and oppressed people around the world. Now, the how would you organize a millions of refugees that don't live in the same place, and they were shattered all over the place? And so how do you unify them on a political program? uh, it is not easy. It is a very tough task, but uh, Palestinians, they managed to actually do that through the popular unions and organizations. So they established, for example, in 1958, the General Union of Palestinian Students. This, what we call GUPS. GUPS, the General Union of Palestinian Students, played major role in the struggle for Palestine, not just in universities, but also in the military and political struggle for liberation. They established also the General Union of Palestinian Women. And the Palestinian woman role uh, covers all aspects of struggle, um, and aspects of struggle that usually it's not recognized. But the Palestinian woman had a leadership and a central role in preserving the Palestinian people revolution and identity. And through their unions, they were able to unify Palestinian women all over the world. The same goes on the teachers and the doctors and the various different aspects of the sectors of our society, because that was the only way that you can organize and unify the communities of refugees who live all over the world. And that is exactly today the challenge of Palestinian refugees again, because in the last 30 years, they have lost all of these unions. After the beginning of the so-called Madrid peace process and the Oslo Accords and the negotiations process, uh, the Palestinian leadership or the leadership of the PLO have established the Palestinian Authority inside Palestine. This is an authority that is that has a security and economic role, and it does not have a liberation program. In short, the leadership of the PLO have stabbed the refugees in their back. They sold them out. They sold the right of return. They sold the struggles and the achievements of Palestinian refugees. And who are this sector of Palestinians who did that? It is the capitalist Palestinian sector, the 1%, who actually vacuumed all of these institutions and turned it into agencies and institutions that work for their program. And eventually, all of these popular unions have dissipated and were dismantled. And that's why the popular classes and the refugees today, they don't have that power that they used to have at one point of time, and that is their public and popular institutions. And today, Palestinians must uh, challenge this task again and take this task again of rebuilding their institution the way that this time requires, and not necessarily copy what has been done before, because the world have changed. But at the same time, we feel that Palestinian refugees today are eager to actually mobilize themselves again and to take up the leadership of the movement once again. And why do we say that? Because we see what is happening inside Palestine. As you all know, 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, they are under complete siege by Israel and the Egyptian regime. Palestinians in the West Bank also, and in Palestine occupied in 48, what they call Israel, it's under military and occupation and a system of colonization and apartheid. And so Palestinian refugees outside Palestine must uh, uh, begin to organize themselves in order to change this equation and to say that for the past 30 or 40 years, our voice has been neglected. And so it is important for the young generation as well to stand up and face the challenges that their fathers and mothers once faced. And it's important also to see how sometimes Palestinian refugees were displaced more than one time because of wars and aggression. So if you go, for example, to Europe and you ask Palestinian refugees and immigrant communities there, how did you arrive to Germany or how did you arrive to France or to Sweden, they will tell you either after a massacre that took place or after a war that took place or after, certain racist laws that were taken against them. So Palestinians had to become refugees sometime more than one time and displaced more than one time. And when we talk about refugees, we are actually talking about the popular and impoverished classes. So these are the classes that have a direct interest in change and direct interest in the process of liberation and return. And today, for example, there are almost 6 million Palestinians living inside Palestine, and there is about 7 million Palestinians who live outside Palestine. So when we look at the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, it has kind of two wings, the Palestine inside the homeland and outside the homeland. And the two is one united liberation movement, and it could always, whenever they unify, within a revolutionary project, the situation changed completely, and Palestinians launched either an intifada or a revolution. And today we are looking at how Palestinians are actually, when you look at the refugee camps, for example, that they go through challenges, economic and social challenges, but also they are subjugated to all kind of oppression. So in Lebanon, for example, there are 70 professions that Palestinians cannot work. They're not allowed to work in, and this will mean that they're pushing Palestinian refugees to depend on international agencies and the UNRWA and USAID and these kind of institutions, because once Palestinians depend on themselves, they are able to stand up and fight for their rights. So the reason that they always under this constant pressure and oppression is because they don't want them to become free from, especially the economic chains that they are subjugated to, and be able to be free in their political and social organizing. I don't want to go too much into details, but I will say that the struggle of the Palestinian people is really the struggle of Palestinian refugees in essence. And it's the struggle for Palestinian right to return home and for liberation. And um, this is the only way that Palestinians could actually identify themselves on the even basis of existentialist questions like who they are and their identity and how do they relate to Palestine. the displacement and exile has shaped the Palestinian identity. But this identity must be, in order to live, it has to be associated with resistance. So resistance and revolution is not a choice for Palestinians only. It is the only choice for Palestinians in order to preserve their identity and who they are, their culture, their history, and also their aspirations and goals for liberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Khaled, for thank you so much, Comrade Khaled, for giving us a comprehensive history of Palestinian refugees and their role in the Palestinian struggle, as well as in revolutionary internationalism. What we've learned is that from the dominant perspective of multilateral institutions and NGOs, refugees are hapless, helpless people who are in constant need of donations. But Comrade Khaled has given us a fresh perspective, similar to what the Lumad refugees from Mindanao have been telling us. They are called bakwit, or evacuees. And in both cases, Palestinian refugees and our Lumad brothers and sisters, uh, the refugee status has been transformed into a lifelong commitment to resistance. And what Khaled calls the popular and impoverished class is also a fighting class. And this is precisely why the Palestinians in the homeland and in diaspora are our comrades in the struggle for national liberation here in the Philippines and anywhere where people are fighting against imperialism toward a bright socialist future. Thank you so much, Comrade Khaled. And now for our next speaker, I'm sure she needs no introduction, but nevertheless, I'm very proud to tell you that Nerdine has been to the Philippines some years ago, a few years back, and she, together with comrades from within our lifetime, Dan Sioni and Bayan USA, Mike Legaspi, they toured the different national democratic mass organizations, visited workers and farmers in different sectors. And they also visited the University of the Philippines. So that's how we first met, and gave a lecture to our students, and also asked to have a meeting with our union. I remember that day when our unionists learned that our comrades from Palestine are here, they dropped everything and say, yes, we're going to listen. We have to have that meeting. So our speaker is a student of law at the City University of New York, and she's one of the lead voices of Within Our Lifetime. So let's all welcome Comrade Nerdine Kiswani.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that amazing introduction, Sarah. I really appreciate that you mentioned that I went to the Philippines, because I always make sure to mention that at so many different events and speeches that I give, because I truly believe that that trip was very integral to my political development, and even the founding of my organization was very much within our lifetime, was very much inspired by the work that Anak Bayan and Bayan was doing in the United States, in New York City, you know, as a student in Hunter College, like you were mentioning earlier. You know, we were building very closely with Anak Bayan, and it was also very beautiful and inspiring for me as, you know, someone who I identify as a Palestinian refugee, because you know, I didn't have the choice not to be born in Palestine. I was born in Jordan and emigrated here at a young age. My father was born in Palestine. All four of my grandparents were born in Palestine, and I would have been born there too had my family not been forced to fled from their own homeland due to the Zionist militias, you know, coming and kicking us out and threatening and causing havoc, fear, and killing Palestinians in 1948. So it was very inspiring for me to see another group of people who also have a homeland, that they're fighting for, and that they can fight for that homeland from here, and that they can coordinate and work with, groups and people back home, something that Palestinians have been denied by different laws in the US to do, unless, we work with a very specific subset that, are the comprador class that are upholding the occupation. So, we've been placed in this unique situation, and many times it's while Palestine has been at the center of revolutionary imagination across the world and people's struggles for liberation, a lot of times it's difficult to see, I don't really see many groups doing the work as well as and as amazing as, Bayan and Anak Bayan and the whole the movement for national democracy in the Philippines have been doing. So, we very much see that as a model for us, because we know that what happens in Palestine has ripple effects from South Africa to the Philippines and vice versa, and that movements against colonialism and imperialism have looked to Palestine for its consistent resistance for over 70 years, and now we look to the Philippines, because the struggle for national democracy and socialism in the Philippines for liberation is one that continuously allies itself with Palestinian liberation. And we know that the importance of solidarity comes out of revolutionary internationalist necessity. In the Philippines, solidarity with Palestine traces back all the way to the 80s, and Palestinians were even part of mass organizations in the National Democratic Front. And we know that Israel and the government of the Philippines exist as US outposts, advancing the interests of US hegemony at the expense of Filipino, Palestinian, and oppressed nations all over the globe, and that we have the same enemies. I was asked to, cover certain topics today, so I'm responding to some very crucial questions that can help develop our understanding about Palestinians, our history, and how the world can better understand the Palestinian right of return and what people can do to contribute to the struggle. So the first question is, what caused the exodus of the Palestinians? As was mentioned before, the Nakba was caused by Zionist militias carrying out premeditated campaigns of ethnic cleansing and genocide to make way for a settler state of Israel. Throughout the Nakba, almost 1 million Palestinians fled their homeland as refugees. One of the pivotal moments of the Nakba was the Deir Yassin massacre on April 9th in 1948, where more than 250 Palestinians were murdered in cold blood by Zionist militias. And that's actually the massacre that my family heard about when they, had to flee Betiksa, because they were told if they stayed there, then the same thing was going to happen to them. So they heard the stories of men digging their own graves, of women being raped, and, they had to flee in order to escape that violence. And that's what Zionists did strategically as well. All throughout Palestine, they made sure to go to different villages so that the surrounding villages can hear about, the news of what happened to their neighbors, and cause, deep fear with them and force them out of their villages. And then, they moved into their houses. Some people say, well, these are sayings, but while the coffee was still warm, still on the table, just poured, moved into their houses as is. And reflecting on how terrorism was used by Zionist forces to ethnically cleanse Palestine in the spring of 1948, Menachem Begin, who led the forces that carried out Deir Yassin massacre, later wrote in 1983, without what was done at Deir Yassin, there would not have been a state of Israel. So we understand that the existence of Israel necessitates this very genocide and settler colonialism over Palestinian people and land. And what places have they found refuge? Well, like I said before, my family, faced the fate of many Palestinians. They were forced to flee to Jordan. And, we can talk endlessly about the different laws and oppression that Palestinians are subjected to in neighboring Arab countries, including Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, that Khaled also touched upon earlier, particularly with Lebanon. But, the vast majority of Palestinians don't live on our land, but in refugee camps or just in neighboring Arab countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, and in the diaspora around the world. Many of those that manage to stay within the small area that has been designated by the Palestinian Authority are internal refugees from other cities in historic Palestine. And it has been these expelled Palestinian refugees who've been the vanguard of the fight against Zionism, keeping the fight alive despite attempts by all sides to silence it. We have Palestinians that are also within 48 that, people try to erase by calling them Arab Israelis when they are, very much Palestinians, but even they have 50 plus laws that discriminate against them. So, just the situation for Palestinians is fragmented and oppressive no matter where they go. Some of the conditions that Palestinians in the diaspora had to live with, we can just go back to this summer of 2019, where Palestinians in refugee camps across Lebanon led protests to demand the repeal of the Lebanese labor law that banned the Syrian and Palestinian refugees from working without visas. And that led to mass unemployment and a crackdown on refugee workers. Because we know that Palestinian refugees in Lebanon are barred from 72 regulated professions. These Palestinians were demanding, and Lebanon were demanding the granting of clear legal status to Palestinian refugees with civil, economic, and social rights, asking for the cancel of the labor law and ending the ongoing discrimination against Palestinian refugees in a range of so many areas, including allowing them to own their own property. I'm also was asked to answer, how can the world better understand the Palestinian right of return? We believe that the displacement and forced migration of Palestinians connects the struggles of many oppressed nationalities who are forced to flee their homelands due to dangerous conditions created or exacerbated by Western imperialism. Our enemies are the same and operate in our homelands despite the distance and separation. Zionism is the guardian dog of imperialism, not only in the Middle East, but also in the occupied lands of North and South America. The Zionist enemy has taken advantage of the people to advance the goals of imperialism for decades. US intervention in Latin America is well known, but the role of Zionist state in suppressing popular movements has been suppressed. For example, the US-backed dictator Somoza killed 50,000 people in Nicaragua, and 98% of the weapons that were provided were by Israel. Israel was also the largest arms smuggler for the US-backed death squads in Guatemala in the 80s, and it supplied weapons to the Contra death squads, to Pinochet, to Salvadorans, and to Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and the military dictatorship in Argentina, and now even the fascist Bolsonaro in Brazil. We also know that that Israel provides weapons to the government of the Philippines that have used it, or use that against their own people. The relationship between the United States, Israel, and the GPH with dictator-backed regimes continues around the world. And we know that the US and Israel work together in order to maintain that. So we know that a win for people in the Philippines, for the people in Palestine, and for oppressed nations here in the US, from the Black nation to the Chicano nation here, to even the movement for a free Puerto Rico, and so many other movements contribute to one another, because we are at the end of the day fighting the same enemy. So when we make gains for one movement, that inspires people all over the world, as well as materially weakens one of the links of imperialism that are chaining us. And what can be done specifically to contribute to the Palestinian right of return, the campaign for that, and just supporting Palestinian liberation overall is the last question, and I'm just kind of, going quickly through everything because I don't know. I think if there's Q&A, I'd rather leave more time for that. But ultimately, I believe that, we do have to understand that the Palestinian struggle cannot be minimized to just Palestine. As Khaled has been saying, this is really a refugee struggle as well. Ultimately, even more because most of our people, again, do not live within, the borders of what is now known, what part of Palestine or 48, but also, all over the world. Most of us live outside of Palestine. So we must defend the right of Palestinians to fight for our right to return by any and all means necessary, no matter how that fight takes place. And for generations, Palestinians who fought for return have been labeled as, what terrorists and sympathizers and anti-Semites. They've been imprisoned, they've been deported and assassinated, in the US and in Israel. And if Palestinians are uniting in exile to participate more fully and the struggle for return, the criminalization of that and Palestinian political life needs to be brought to an end here in the US. And we really need a global movement in order to recognize the legitimacy of Palestinian struggle, because it's something that's consistently put into question, and international solidarity is necessary to help the world and make the world understand that Palestinians have the right to return, and no matter how we fight for that right, we are legitimized. We are fighting an anti-settler colonial struggle, and we're the occupied people, we're the oppressed people. So no matter how we fight for that right, whether it's the people of Gaza waging the Great Return March, whether it's, whatever we can do here from the US, that must be supported. And we also have to uplift the demand to free all of our political prisoners. I specifically want to uplift Maher al-Akhras right now, who's currently entering his 91st day of hunger strike and protest of this indefinite detention without charge or trial under administrative detention by Israel. And we really need to amplify the call for his freedom, because he could face irreversible damage right now. Palestinians have held hunger strikes for so long, and Palestinian prisoners are also the vanguard of our movement, who've put everything, on the line and are paying the ultimate price, the ultimate sacrifice with their lives, being tortured, being, placed in these unjust conditions while so much of the world turns its back. So we really need to, uplift these people, and their campaigns have to be much stronger. We really need global support because, he's not the only one who's on hunger strike. Throughout the whole time I've been organizing, we always hear every year about Palestinians who've held record lengths of going on hunger strike. And they must be supported in their endeavors. So those are two things that I want to end with. And I thank you so much for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Nardine, for emphasizing the plight of Palestinian prisoners. We really need to actually boost our campaign on that particular issue, and we're looking forward to working with you within our lifetime and Samidun for that campaign. And of course, thank you for emphasizing how our struggle are indeed very much connected, that our struggles impact not only our march toward liberation, but how we actually want our personal lives to contribute significantly to the goals of the peoples in the global south. And our struggles, protected as they may be, are actually making us the comrades that we want to become, the people who will deserve the bright future that we are fighting for. Thank you so much. So our last speaker is a wonderful comrade and a friend of mine, and she's been with the People's Strike, and she's been an active member of her community in Brooklyn. She's also a professor in the City University of New York, and she is one of the few scholars who have really staked a claim on anti-imperialist politics, anti-imperialist research, and she is specializing in Tunisia and, well, the Arab region. And we're very happy to have her with us today. I'd like to call on and ask you all to welcome Comrade Karina Molin.
Thank you so much for that really kind introduction, Comrade Sarah, and to all of my comrades, our comrades at ILPS. Thank you so much for organizing this important event. And also thank you to Nardine and Khalid for those really powerful and amazing presentations. I really have nothing to add to these descriptions of settler Zionist, settler colonial rule and the forms of resistance it has engendered. And Nardine and Khalid are certainly better placed than I am to discuss this element of tonight's discussion. So I will take up the question that Sarah asked me to focus on, which is the relationship between U.S. imperialism and Zionism. So often when thinking about the U.S. role in Palestine and thinking about the way in which people in the U.S. context in particular organize to mobilize support for Palestinian liberation, oftentimes the statistics are referred to about how much U.S. aid is given to Israel, the money that the U.S. spends on supporting Israel. And of course, that makes a lot of sense in terms of generating support, mobilizing support in thinking about the impact that that U.S. support for Israel has on the U.S. economy. It's often, presented as thinking about the statistics that are presented. Since 1948, the U.S. has spent over $134 billion of aid to Israel. In the past few decades, it's been around 3.1 billion, more recently 3.8 billion a year. And these are always presented as expenses or a burden on US taxpayers. But as both Nardine and Khalid have discussed, what this approach leaves out, or what gets obscured by this approach, as important as it may be sort of strategically in terms of generating support for the movement, is how much wealth is actually accumulated as a result of US support for Israel. In order to understand this equation, we need to think more deeply about US imperialism and the central role played by Israel in securing the interests of US monopoly capital, not only in the Middle East, but increasingly in Africa as well. As the ex-NATO commander Alexander Haig put it, the US must support Israel, he said, because it is the largest American aircraft carrier in the world that cannot be sunk, does not carry even one American soldier, although that's not true, and is located in a critical region for American national security. So the centrality of Israel to US imperialism, of course, is not new. It's been there from the beginning. Israel was central to imperialist designs on the region, first for the British and then for the US. The Zionist movement presented both through ideological and material means an opportunity for imperialist powers to secure their interests in the region. In order to garner support for the establishment of the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, the early Zionist movement reproduced European racist ideology, the same ideology that was, of course, responsible for othering the European Jewish community itself, presenting the proposed Jewish state in Zionist leader Theodor Herzl's words as potentially, quote, forming a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. So similar to the US settler colonialism, the racist origins narrative presented Palestine as a land without people for a people without land. The Zionist movement proposed itself as the required human element to lead the Palestinian outpost in Europe's fight against so-called Arab backwardness, and supported the Balkanization of former Ottoman territories through the Sykes-Picot Agreement first in 1916, and then followed by the post-war division of Arab lands through the League of Nations mandate system, continuing to push for the creation of smaller sectarian states in cooperation with both French and British imperialist powers. As Abdul Wahab Kayali argues in his Zionism, Imperialism, Historical Origins, the creation of a Jewish state in the region was seen as a strategic opportunity in the context of the growth and expansion of US imperialism, which necessitated the search for new sources of raw materials and markets for the finished products, in addition to securing the lines of commercial and military communication. Israel's creation was seen as central to the imperialist aim of stifling Arab nationalism and self-determination in the region. So I want to think about a little bit more deeply the material basis of the US relationship, Israel relationship, and reflect on a few of its key features, including Israel's central role in the US-dominated military security industrial complex, excuse me, a central mode of accumulation to contemporary forms of racial capitalism, as well as for expanding and protecting US empire, facilitating value drain from the periphery to the center of the global capitalist economic system, as well as the central role Israel continues to play in undermining the possibilities for alternative political, social, and economic projects based on solidarity, self-determination, and a rejection of colonial capitalist modes of development within the Arab world, as well as the broader global South. So I just wanted to start with a few words about imperialism and how it's defined, and then think about Israel's role and the relationship between Israel and the US here. While scholars like David Harvey argue that imperialism is no longer useful as an analytical category, a look at any number of socioeconomic indicators statistically mapped onto an image of the globe makes clear that the north-south center periphery cleavage is still salient when it comes to patterns of accumulation and dispossession. Whether we look at it through the lens of public health, monopoly finance capital, global commodity chains, labor exploitation, unequal exchange, sanctions, climate disaster, or military interventions, it's clear that there's a stark dimension to how power is divided and exercised across the globe. Lenin, of course, described imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, entailing several features, including the emergence and domination of monopolies and finance capital, and the territorial division of the world among the biggest capitalist powers. For Nkrumah, imperialism is the system through which, even after political independence had been achieved across Africa, practically, and this is his quote, our natural resources, not to mention trade, shipping, banking, building, have remained in the hands of foreigners seeking to enrich alien investors and to hold back local economic initiative. At its base, imperialism is a system of domination that blocks real self-determination for states and peoples. It is about externally determining and imposing, often together with the collaboration of elements of a domestic elite, particular modes of industrialization, socio-political forms of governance, and bordering practices that facilitate labor exploitation and the drain of value from the periphery or the global South to the center or global North. It's about blocking alternative ways of imagining and pursuing development, value, and of living with one another and with the earth. The imperialist aim is to obstruct the pursuit of alternative socio-political economic projects and sabotage existing ones that threaten capitalist power. As Ali Kadri reminds us, the state-led developmentalist projects of the post-independence era implemented across West Asia and Africa did not fail on their own. It was the implicit and explicit forms, he said, of imperialism that shut them down. And in that sense, imperialism, of course, is always about violence. There's the structural violence that results from what Walter Rodney described as the paradox of underdevelopment, where many parts of the world that are naturally rich are actually poor. And there is, of course, the material violence. Imperialism is backed up by the threat and often actual shock and awe of military might. So we're all too familiar with the long list and typology of imperialist interventions, from invasions and occupations, coups, death squads, and other forms of violence. Through destabilization, destruction, and currency devaluation, wars and occupations enable numerous forms of extraction and exploitation of natural and human resources. The waste-making destruction of imperialist wars and militarism contributes to an expansion of the global reserve army of labor, and it creates the material conditions for the super exploitation of global South labor and surplus value extraction. It also paves the way for economic intervention of the so-called multilateral, or in other words, imperialist financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank that contribute further to the situation of underdevelopment by forcing through their notorious structural adjustment programs that seek to weaken and destabilize the global South and make it incapable of true sovereignty. These economic interventions, combined with the increased investment global South states are required to make into building the institutions of organized violence, such as the police and military, in order to repress popular movements and control so-called problematic populations, or those expanding ranks of the unemployed and poor, and to manage the overall social contradictions that arise from an imperialist-driven neoliberal economy, lead to increased levels of neocolonial debt and therefore greater levels of dependency. The military security industrial complex is, of course, central to racial capitalist modes of accumulation in the current stage of capitalism, not only in terms of providing the means through which the global South state can discipline their own populations in a way that facilitates surplus value drain, but also, of course, in terms of the actual wealth generated from weapons sales, as the US remains by far the largest exporter of arms in the world. Last year, US arms firms generated $192 billion in profit. The US accounted for 36% of exports, up from 31% during the 2010 to 2014 period. Middle Eastern countries are some of the largest consumers of these exports, and combined imported 61% more arms during the 2015 to 2019 period, combined with to 5 years earlier, with Saudi Arabia now the region's and the world's top arms importer. Although we think about the billions the US gives to Israel each year as aid, a large portion of that money is required to be spent on US arms industry, so acts as a sort of subsidy on the US military industrial complex. The US dominated military industrial complex continues to be one of the most visible mechanisms of imperialism today. While much is made of Russia and China as competing powers for global hegemony, it is telling that the US spends more on national defense than the other countries included on the list of top 8 military spenders combined, including France, the UK, Germany, India, Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia. The US dominated arms market also perpetuates financialization of the global capitalist economy, as the top arms dealers are all publicly traded. The US continues to dominate with 42 of the top 100 listed arms companies based in the US. The number of US private equity and venture firms specializing in the defense sector is also expanding, with firms like Veritas Capital and Civitas Group specializing in investing in defense startups, providing investment capital to fuel growth in weapons development and steer even more private dollars into the military sector. Venture capital firms have been particularly active in areas like financing state surveillance projects in the Gulf. The speculative role of arms capital was on display as major US arms companies saw their stock prices jump following the Trump administration's assassination of the leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, Qasem Soleimani, in January of this year. In supplying their arms to the global South, these merchants of death not only provide the conditions to alienate citizens from their states, but also to alienate global South states from one another, as they find themselves caught up in conflicts that are not of their own making, nor in their own interest. Israel plays an important role in contributing to the expansion of the military-industrial complex. Nardine laid a lot of this out. I just want to bring in a couple of points about the specifics of how the inputs that Israel makes into the military-industrial complex, especially in terms of modern IT and robot technology. Israel is a pioneer of drone production and in the use of drones for surveillance and assassination, particularly relevant now that drones are an important tool, of course, of US global domination. In this niche, Israel has played a vital role for the military-industrial complex. And this is where Israel specializes in the absence of its own heavy industry. US arms companies provide the hardware, but Israeli companies provide vital scientific and electronic expertise and have been responsible for many improvements. These modifications are worth billions of dollars. Israel's utilization of American arms guarantees its existence, but at the same time gives US military industries a competitive edge compared to European industries, while also boosting American military production. Israel has also been a world leader in the development of unmanned aerial systems, both for intelligence collection and combat. And of course, when I say combat here, that means assassination. And it has shared with the US military the technology, the doctrine, and its experience regarding these systems. Israel is also a global pace setter in armored vehicle protection, defense against short-range rockets, and the techniques and procedures of robotics, all of which it shares with the United States. The Global South, and Palestine in particular, has become the live fire testing ground for many of these new technologies and equipments, where new systems are tested and perfected. So we know that during the Cold War, Israel played an important role in US efforts to dominate the region in the name of regional stability and to defeat Arab nationalism, Pan-Africanism, Third Worldism, and other forms of transnational anti-imperialist solidarity. In the neoliberal or Infitah era, Israel played an important role as part of the counter-revolution on global South sovereignty, working to destroy what was left of developmentalist states and Arab sovereignty, and therefore to facilitate US domination of the region's natural resources, as well as its ability to benefit from its exploited exploited labor and capture regional, especially Gulf capital, through arms sales, finance, and investment. US global primacy was one of the main outcomes of the Cold War, and after the first Gulf War, Israel's regional military superiority was again reconfirmed or imagined to be. In the context of the so-called war on terror, the US used the pretext of counterterrorism at the same time that it has been funding and training, of course, terrorist death squads to further integrate the states of the region into its imperialist security architecture, including through military trainings, joint operations, the subcontracting out of the region's militaries, and the exchange of technologies, equipment, and techniques to further entrench racialized police, carceral, and military states. Israel often plays an important role in this strategy of security incorporation as one of the leading producers of so-called security knowledge and equipment, therefore pushing through the imperialist agenda of fragmentation and desolidarization in the global South. One of the reasons that we should think about the war on terror, and this is a term that I know Sarah Raimundo has used and I think is a really apt one, of counterinsurgency. As in the Philippines, the war on terror in the Middle East, of course, has been used as a way to justify and enable imperialist plunder, peasant and working class exploitation and dispossession, and repressive governance, among other things. Normalization has also been key to this agenda. Although Egypt and Jordan were the first steps to officially normalize relations with Israel in 79 and 94, respectively, there have been unofficial steps towards normalization in the subsequent years, with many states in the region entering into security partnerships with Israel, investments, and other forms of collaboration on the level of material exchange and knowledge production. In the past year, we have had a drive towards another round of official normalization with the UAE and Bahrain, followed by just this week, Trump announcing that Sudan would be normalizing relations in exchange for being removed from the US list of state sponsors of terrorism, unblocking economic aid and investment, and in an example of how the war on terror economic leveraging has become a central economic tool of imperialism. Trump also said yesterday that at least 5 more Arab states wanted to normalize relations with Israel. As Khalid Barakat has said, and I hope that I'm quoting you right from a talk I heard a couple of months ago, the language of normalization reminds us how unnormal recognition of settler colonialism is by other formerly colonized states. What's even worse, he said, is that than the economic or material dimension is that the colonized is forced to adopt the narrative of the colonizer. One of the central colonial narratives over the years, it has been that which distinguishes so-called moderate, which is basically any state or government, no matter how repressive or reactionary, that is happy to or coerced into accepting the status quo of US imperialism and Israeli settler colonial rule, versus the so-called extremists, basically any state or popular movement that rejects the same order. In addition to performing an important legitimizing and delegitimizing function, these discourses also undermine at the level of imagination the possibility of thinking beyond current colonial and imperialist structures and relations of power. The moderate extremist dichotomy, of course, has its roots in the era of European colonial rule and was used to delegitimize anti-colonial struggle. It was also used to delegitimize nationalist and socialist states in the context of the Cold War and was given a new lease on life in the context of 9/11. It is now used, as well as for all these other things, to delegitimize and criminalize all kinds of resistance in the region, in the global South more broadly, as well as in the US, as Nordine discussed, and has been demonstrated by the recent Zoom saga, the public attacks on scholars and organizers seeking to raise awareness of the Palestinian liberation struggle, and of course, primarily targeting Palestinian scholars and activists. So Israel's role has been, on the whole, to facilitate this geopolitical alignment of the Arab world and increasingly on the African continent as well, with US empire through economic and military means. And for this service, Israel has been substantially rewarded, with the US supporting Israel's settler colonial violence and expansion. So it, excuse me, just to sort of conclude, it often seems that the odds are stacked against the oppressed, and that imperialist power is so overwhelming that it will be impossible to move. And in this context, it's easy to become despondent and disillusioned. This is why we must look back for inspiration to the popular people struggles across the continent that have resisted in the face of similarly unfavorable odds, from the anti-slavery revolts to the anti-colonial struggles, from the communist revolutions to the Black liberation movement. Just as contemporary imperialism is the product of an accumulation of material and ideological residues from past iterations, so too must our anti-imperialist struggle valorize and be informed by the heritage that is bequeathed to us by our revolutionary ancestors. And as our two brave comrades on this panel, Nordine and Khalid, remind us, the Palestinian liberation struggle, with its steadfastness and constant resistance in the face of one of the most powerful settler colonial states, backed by the globe's most powerful imperialist state, should be held up as a powerful example for us all to follow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karina. That was, wow, that was really mind-blowing. You are truly a force of nature. I have nothing to add to that. It was very clear. And if there's something I'd like to, well, think reinforce would be, your point about the central role of Israel in the global military infrastructure of the United States. Just last year, from the end of June up to the first week of July, the Israeli Defense Forces were here to train our elite soldiers from the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the Philippine National Police. So that was in July of last year. And came August of last year, there was already a memorandum of agreement between the United States Embassy and the Philippine National Police to build a counterinsurgency center in the south of Luzon, in southern part of Luzon in Cavite, which was initially funded by the US with $10 million. So yes, and I would like to just really amplify what Karina has said about the importance of learning more about and being on the side of the fighting people who are fighting for national liberation all over the world. Um, and I guess we've come to this phase of our webinar where we are inviting questions from our audience here on Zoom as well as on YouTube. Our panelists will be happy to answer your questions, and I'm sure they will be happier to hear your comments. And there's already a question here. It's from Sandrine Dawood. Uh, what do you say to people who mention the racism towards Palestinians from other Arab countries as a way to excuse what Israel is doing and has done?
I can say a few quick words on that. But before that, I want to thank Corina and Nardine for their very knowledgeable introduction and intervention here. I learned so much from both speakers, and so thank you. And I think that when we look at the relationship between the Arabs and Palestine, we need to differentiate on two levels. There is the Arab regimes and there's the Arab people. And the Arab regimes, I can say across the board, from Oman to Morocco, they not one of them was truly elected. Maybe with the exception of Tunisia, these regimes do not represent the uh, people will of the Arab people will. And we look at, for example, Egypt. They had a relationship with Israel since 1979 officially, but the people of Egypt are not normalizing relationship with Israel, despite all the attempts to have these normalization on a popular level. They failed. Polls after polls are showing that the vast majority of people in Bahrain, for example, are against their government normalization with Israel. If you looked at the reaction of the people of Sudan after the announcement of Trump, they practically went out in the street and burned the building where it's supposed to be an Israeli embassy. So the people are the vast majority of Arabs consider Palestine to be their cause, and it is the central cause of the Arab people. They also understand that Israel, as a colonialist settler project, is there not just to attack or target the Palestinians, but it's also there to be a tool for imperialists to attack Arabs and people and any democratic or secular movement in the Arab world. We know that Israel's role throughout the years was targeting Arab secular and democratic and communist movements around the world. And the relationship between these regimes and Israel is a very long relationship. It's not new. What we are witnessing, it's not actually normalization. It's building an ally, a public alliance between Israel and these Arab reactionary regimes under, of course, the supervision and the care of the United States. Of course, there are right-wing forces in the Arab world. In Lebanon, for example, the phalangists who associate themselves with Israel and the Western powers, they're a racist, fascist Lebanese party that have carried massacres against the Palestinian people. And if you watch the media in Lebanon, especially in a country that is sectarianism is the system that guides the Lebanese government and political system. You will find all kind of racist stuff on a daily basis against Palestinians. So there is a lot of work on people to, what we call shaitanat al-Falastini, making Palestinians as the Satan and the problem. And it's pretty much, when they talk about their economic crisis, when they talk about all of these issues, you'll hear about that it's because of Palestinians. And that's very much the same discourse when they talk about immigrants and refugees in countries that to justify, their racist policies, they will attack refugees and immigrants and consider them to be the cause of the crisis or the problem. We see that, in Germany and US and elsewhere. So I think that, this is what I can say, but we do need to work in building an alliance between Palestinians and Arabs, and also to create what we call the Arab popular incubator of the Palestinian struggle that will always be there. Just in the last 10 years, a lot of things have changed after the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt and elsewhere, where Arab masses found themselves in the streets calling for change and for, regime, for democracy and freedom. And unfortunately, these uprisings and popular uprisings were directed in so many different places to serve reactionary forces and not to serve the truly aspirations and goals of the masses. And that's because of many reasons. I'm not going to get into it now, but mostly the absence of the revolutionary leftist organized parties. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much, Khaled. Does anybody in the panel, Nardine or Corina, would like to respond to that? Okay, so
I
we
would
have
just say he covered it very well. So I don't have anything to add, but I see another question, unless Karina wants to add
a
something.
question from Nardine. Was Nardine saying something, or shall we move on to the next question?
No, I was just saying unless Karina wants to say anything about the other one.
All right. So this is another question from Farouk Hamed, which is not a question, but a request. I think Farouk is referring to the speech by Karina. Please, can we get a copy of your speech? I love it. So here, and I think
Me too.
yeah, we can do all of our speakers if they can, so we can post it on our website and it will be available to everyone. Okay, the next question is from Benjamin Zidar. How should we see the relationship between the Palestinian struggle and religion? Stephen Salaita recently wrote about this phenomenon of Muslim opportunists who claim to speak on behalf of Palestinians to the imperialist world on a religious basis. Saudi and Emirati figures do similar, but we know there are many militants from Palestinian Christian backgrounds. And then again, Islam also provides a basis of resistance for some people and groups. And even Leila Khaled, if I recall correctly, has said secular groups like the PFLP are immersed in an Islamic culture.
I'll just jump in quickly and say, I think most Palestinians understand and recognize that Palestine is a political struggle about land against settler colonialism, first and foremost, regardless of any religious background. And, we've always been a people, in the US, I remember this campaign when I was younger called Coexist. And you would see they would have the moon and the crescent moon and a star for Islam and a cross. And they would have the Star of David, spelling this out. And to me, this was always a very funny concept because They were celebrating this idea of being able to simply exist next to one another, which is something that, not only have Palestinians been existing together, but we've been celebrating each other's cultures, religious practices for centuries. My grandmother, I remember growing up, she would tell me stories of when she was a child. She would, during the spring, they would have to go find these colorful eggs around their village and everything. And I realized, grandmother, you're describing Easter, which is a Christian holiday that, by the way, this is actually the original Christian holiday that was the big holiday, not Christmas. And the US like commodified this concept of Christmas and blew it, but it was actually Easter that was seen as the big holiday by Christians. And Palestinians used to celebrate, Palestinian Muslims used to celebrate that. Palestinian Christians celebrate Eid. So I wouldn't necessarily link the Palestinian struggle and religion in that sense, but only for the fact that, whatever religion that you follow, if you're able to find calls for justice in that, calls for, struggling for what, for your people, for what's right, for your land, then that's something that, people all over the world use. And we have, Muslims in Palestine and Christians in Palestine and in Palestine who, they understand that, their religious beliefs call them to fight for a liberated Palestine. And, even these people who speak on our behalf, they're not able, who claim to be Muslims that speak on Palestinians' behalf, we don't see them as actually doing that. I believe just recently, Palestinians didn't allow Emirati people to attend Al-Aqsa Mosque. And Palestinians have, called against the normalization of Israel since 1948, and they don't allow people who normalize Israel's existence or who want to go visit Israel to visit Al-Aqsa Mosque as well, which is the third holiest religious site in Islam. So we're very unified in that sense, and our Palestinian identity, our struggle for freedom ties us together more than, anything else.
Thank
If
you.
I can say just a couple of points about religion, because it is being used and utilized, especially by Israel, because Israel always like to portray the conflict as if it's a religious conflict. And it's for them an argument that they sell in order to create fear, especially amongst Jewish people all over the world. That the problem is that between Jews and Muslims, and of course this is rubbish and garbage, and any check on that from a historical context, and you'll see that there was never an issue, for example, in Palestine, particularly between Palestinians, Muslims, Christians versus Jews, or vice versa. It's dangerous game that they play, and they play it, and we know the role of the evangelicals and the supporters of Trump, and how they utilize religion in order to justify why people should support Israel. But also Palestinians, maybe we have a duty to claim Jesus Christ as because he is a Palestinian, and so one of the first things we are going to liberate is Jesus, because he was born in Palestine, and in the sense that even in our art, whether Muslims or Christians, Palestinians, they associate themselves in a revolutionary religious figures and messages, and not reactionary messages, because as you know, religion could always be utilized in both ways. Just wanted to say this quick note, and just to be careful, especially that I know I was watching, for example, a couple of years ago, the Israeli ambassador in the Philippines, and his activities in the Philippines were targeting particularly communities to sell them this false idea that, you know, Christians are being oppressed in Palestine, and that you should support, you know, Israel because Israel supports Christians. And of course, this is bogus. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Khaled. Comrade Bong Labog manifested and he wants to ask a question. Go ahead, Kabong.
Yeah. The latest accord that has been signed recently in the Washington, in the White House, is the Abraham Accords. And this has brought the alliance with Israel, the US, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. To borrow Nerdin's words, it has a rippling effect from Africa to the Philippines, whatever developments there are. And indeed, I think, according to Cohen, who's the head of the Mossad, Somaliland and Sudan is lined up to establish peace accords with this group too. But on the other hand, Qatar and Turkey has formed an alliance with the Libyan government. And so these are the developments. But my question is, it has been Israel's dream to re-establish the Gulbenkian era pipelines to be called the transatlantic Pacific, all the way from Mosul to Kirkuk to Haifa. What would be the impact of these developments in the Middle East and the Palestinian struggle if this plan of Israel would push through in reopening the Gulbenkian pipelines?
I don't know if anybody wants to say something, Nardine or Verena.
Go ahead, Khaled.
Go ahead.
I think that there are many plans today in terms of oil and natural gas, particularly. In fact, some of the things that has been happening in the Arab world and in Syria, for example, is due to finding a huge reserves of natural gas and oil in Lebanon and in the shores of Palestine as well. And these plans are very old ones. The Mosul to Haifa transportation, for example, the train has been, you know, a long time ago. I'm not sure if you follow also the deal that took place between Egypt and Saudi Arabia of selling the two islands of Sanafir and Tiran. When you look at the Israeli strategy today, especially in the Red Sea and in the region, you would see that Israel actually have military bases today and across from Yemen, in Musawwa, and you know, their nuclear submarines is in the Red Sea, and this is to build an economic alliance, but also a political and military alliance to push Iran and contain Iran, and also on the long run, China and Russia. But the important thing to, I think, to notice here is that sometime the Turks-Qatari alliance and the Saudi-Emirati alliance sound as if they are the opposite of each other, or they are fighting each other. In fact, they are not in contradiction, they are in competition. So, for example, because they all are capitalist regimes that have a very strategic relationship with the United States, and they all have relationship with Israel, and a normalization with Israel. If you look at the Turkey-Israel relationship and their trade, for example, did not. It's booming. Turkey and Israel have relationships since 1948. The Qataris and Israelis, they have a relationship. But the different, in my view, I see it as a camp. There's one camp that trying to use the policy of the carrot, and the other camp that try to use the policy of the stick. So, for example, you see how Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, they're very harsh when it comes to the Palestinian resistance. They imprison Palestinians, they are willing to target Palestinians, they besiege Palestinians, so they take hard steps against Palestinians, while the Qataris and the Turks, they seem like as if they are supporting Gaza, for example, or they are defending Gaza, for example, with money and what have you. But that's the carrot policy. But eventually, they want to lead Palestinians into surrender and lead Palestinians into the same path. We see how today also the Arab armies have become security police more than army. After the dismantling of the army in Iraq, targeting and Syria, and turning the Egyptian army into a police force. And this is also happening elsewhere, including the Philippines. If you see how there is a militarization of the regime itself. And now these proxies are fighting each other, for example, under the slogans of protecting Libya, for example. But we know that it's competition over Libya, it's competition over Syria, and it's not one camp versus the other.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Khaled. We have another question. Language in the means of spreading colonialism and promulgating division towards Palestine and other Arab countries.
Leave this to Nardine if she wants to, or Corina.
I'm not sure what they're referring to, if it's like language that we use, I guess, like terminology, or actual language. I don't know if anyone else wants to take this.
I guess the same in both.
It's cultural imperialism.
Do they mean the use of language, or how language is being utilized in spreading colonialism?
I think language in a general sense, like how language is being weaponized against the people in order to promote or to promulgate colonialism and imperialism. And I think Karina has touched upon this one in her introduction when she talks about how imperialism has been a term that's been rejected by well-known scholars, but it's something that is it's something that rules the world. We still live in an imperialist system on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's something that's being rejected as a reality in the academe. So maybe something to that effect, or maybe the lack of BS, or how, for example, the discourse of anti-Semitism is being weaponized against Palestinians.
Yes. I think that the first thing that colonizers do, and the people of the Philippines, they understand this very well. They know this like we do, that the first thing that a colonizer do is create a system, a buffer zone between the colonizer and the colonized. They don't want to talk to the people. They want the elitist or the feudalist or the bourgeois or, you know, in the indigenous native population, those who have direct interest in having a relationship with the colonizer, they become the mediators. And some of them also are the one who are, you know, intellectuals. They put the, you know, school curriculum. They control the media. They control publishing houses. So then what happened is that these sectors adopt the colonizer discourse and start feeding it to the people. You know, in Palestine, for example, we call collaborators, or we used to call collaborators, you know, mediators, because it's more of an acceptable word. You can't go to someone and say, you know, you're a collaborator. Can you help me get a driver license? They'll be upset. So we have to find, you know, a word that could be acceptable. Well, now the Palestinian Authority is the authority of the mediators. Those mediators, now they have an authority. They have a prison, they have a police, they have, but also they have the power to put the school curriculum for Palestinian children, you know, and they wanted to feed our children the language of the colonizer. And so to teach us how to, we see that happened also in the indigenous struggle in places like Canada, you know, where they used to take children from their mothers and their fathers and place them in residential schools and literally feed them the discourse of the colonizer. So if language is a very, you know, it's one of those tools that could be just like religion, that could be used for knowledge and renaissance and revolution, and it also could be used as an oppression, a tool of oppression and, you know, ignorance.
Thank you so much. Does Nardine or Corina would like to add something to that? By the way, that question is from Bernard John.
I could say, I would love to hear Nardine as well, just to say that, I don't know, from the perspective of thinking about the kinds of conversations that are shut down in the US context as a result of language, you know, thinking about how, well, firstly, going back to what Khalid was saying and thinking about the language of the colonizers, which is also, of course, used as part of the dehumanization. You know, you have to dehumanize in order to justify the kind of violence and dispossession that colonization entails. And then also thinking about the role of language in the US context, we're sort of up against two difficult situations. On the one hand, you know, there's the establishment that uses the language of extremism and radicalism, you know, to justify, to delegitimize resistance, and to shut down solidarity and, you know, even discussions. I find teaching in CUNY, in the context of where I teach at John Jay, people are, professors are terrified of talking about Palestine in their classes because, you know, there is a student who can, you know, go to some Zionist organization and write up an article about them, send it all around, get them, you know, fired or somehow, you know, impacted negatively. So there's the fear around that. Of course, students are more vulnerable, you know, depending on class, gender, race, there's more vulnerability. So there's that issue as well. But then on the left, you know, this now, you know, the delegitimization of anti-imperialism in many ways, you know, saying that it's no longer an issue, and therefore, you know, there's somehow denying agency by talking about imperialism, which makes it very difficult for mobilizing around anti-imperialist struggle. And so there are multiple levels in which language is operating here to really shut down solidarity and movement building around anti-imperialist struggle in general, but in Palestine in particular.
Thank you so much, Karina. I would just like to remind the audience that we have another webinar coming up on October 26, 4 p.m. Philippine time. It's entitled U.S. War on Terror Intensifies from Palestine to the Philippines. This is organized by Samidun, the Philippines Palestine Friendship Association, and ILPS Commission 10. That's on October 26. And I would just like, as we end our webinar today, I would just like to acknowledge some of our comrades in the audience. We have Amira Lidasan of Sandugo, the Alliance of the National Minorities and Moro in the Philippines. We also have Charlotte Cates, who's organizing for the Samidun Prison Network. We also have Norma Binyas from ILPS, as well as Bill Doris from ILPS. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank our
It's 11
speakers.
o'clock.
Thank you so much. This discussion is so rich, and we're happy that it's recorded and people can just access it on YouTube. We hope to see you on October 27. We will have a face-to-face protest rally at the Commission on Human Rights to call for freedom for Palestine. It's at 10 a.m. So we hope to see you there. There's also going to be another webinar, Free Palestine. This is organized by ILPS Asia Pacific, 7:30 to 9 p.m. In Melbourne time. This is on October 28th. And on that note, I'm hoping to see all of you. I hope to see you on the 27th and on the upcoming webinars. I think Comrade Bong has something to say. Comrade, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, the action on October 27 is actually a global day of action for our Palestinian brothers and sisters. And on October 30, there will be a cultural activity for Palestine. And so we invite our cultural artists to give their contributions on that very significant date, October 30 market. Thank you so much for your participation.
Mabuhay kayo, mabuhay kasamang Khaled, mabuhay kasamang Nardine, at mabuhay kasamang Corina. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Stop the US war machine from Palestine to the Philippines. Thank you so much.
Long live international solidarity.
Long live international solidarity.